Everybody is sitting around waiting for Islam Makhachev to break Anderson Silva's title defense record. And I feel like I am the only person looking at the absolute reality of the situation right now. Islam Makhachev is going to retire. Soon. Maybe entirely sooner than any of you are ready for. And it is going to leave the UFC lightweight division in absolute shambles. You are completely out of your mind if you think Islam is sticking around until he is 35 or 36 years old, defending that belt against whatever new contender the UFC decides to push. We have seen this exact movie before. We saw it play out in real time with Khabib Nurmagomedov. They come in, they absolutely dismantle the division. They figure out the puzzle of the weight class. And the second they realize nobody can touch them, they get bored. They lose the fire. They leave. And right now, if you look closely, Islam Makhachev is bored. Look at his face when the media talks about the Arman Tsarukyan rematch. Look at his body language during these interviews. There's zero excitement there. He already beat Arman. Yes, it was years ago. Yes, it was on short notice. Yes, Arman is a completely different, heavily evolved animal right now. But in Islam's mind, that box is already checked. He is looking at the rest of the lightweight division, a division built on the backs of aging legends and guys he has already figured out. And he is realizing there is no legacy left to build at 155 pounds. People get furious with me when I say this, but this Dagestani retirement plan is a massive problem for the UFC. You cannot build a multi-billion-dollar promotional machine around champions who treat the undisputed belt like a stepping stone to an early pension. Khabib left us with so many unanswered questions. What would he have done against a prime Charles Oliveira? What would he have done against Kamaru Usman at welterweight? We never got the answers because he walked away at his absolute peak. Now, Islam is setting us up for the exact same heartbreak, and the UFC brass knows it. He is talking about welterweight. He has been talking about going up to 170 pounds for over a year. But the UFC does not want Islam Makhachev at welterweight. Why? Because it stalls two divisions. But more importantly, the UFC is utterly terrified of what happens if Islam goes up, beats Belal Muhammad or Shavkat Rakhmonov, grabs at second belt, and then drops the microphone in the middle of the octagon. Think about the nightmare scenario for Dana White and the matchmakers. You have your pound-for-pound king holding two undisputed championships, and he retires on the spot. You suddenly have two completely vacant belts. You have no true champion in the two most stacked divisions in the sport. You just have a bunch of contenders fighting for interim silver medals while the real king is back in the mountains riding horses. Dana White cannot let that happen. That is horrible business. And you can see the friction right now between Islam's camp and the UFC executives. Islam wants legacy fights. He wants double champ status. The UFC wants him to defend against the contenders they spent millions of dollars marketing. Islam is saying he wants to fight for the welterweight title next. Dana White is completely ignoring the request and pushing the Arman Tsarukyan narrative. They are not on the same page, and they haven't been for a long time. If Islam fights Arman and he wins, what is honestly left? Does anybody genuinely want to see him fight Max Holloway at 155? No. We already saw him fight a featherweight twice in Alexander Volkanovski. Does anybody want to see him fight Dan Hooker again? Absolutely not. The lightweight division is completely tapped out for Islam Makhachev. This is why the retirement talk is not just internet rumors or clickbait. It is a calculated exit strategy. These guys do not fight for the love of taking brain damage. They fight for legacy. They fight for generational wealth. And when both of those tanks are full, they are out. Islam's tank is overflowing. I am telling you right now, if Islam Makhachev gets a second belt, he is never fighting again. And if the UFC denies him that second belt, he might just defend one more time, get frustrated by the lack of motivation, and walk away anyway. Either way, the clock is ticking loudly, and nobody wants to acknowledge it because they are too busy pretending the lightweight division is perfectly fine. The UFC loves champions they can rely on. They love guys who will fight 3 times a year, say yes to any opponent, and keep the machine moving. Islam is pulling away from that model. And speaking of guys the UFC absolutely cannot rely on, we need to address the biggest myth in mixed martial arts today. Khamzat Chimaev. Everybody is back on the hype train. He breaks Robert Whittaker's jaw. He looks like a terrifying monster, and suddenly everybody forgets the last 3 years of history. You are being sold wolf tickets with Khamzat Chimaev, and you are buying them wholesale. Is he the most dominant first-round fighter we have ever seen? Yes. Does he possess a level of grappling that completely paralyzes world-class fighters? Absolutely. But Khamzat Chimaev is a part-time fighter, and the UFC knows it. Dana White is in an incredibly tough spot with Khamzat. On one hand, you have a guy with the aura of a prime Mike Tyson. When he walks the cage, it is an event. People tune in just to see the destruction. But on the other hand, you have a guy whose immune system seems to be made of glass. You have a guy who misses weight by historical margins. You have a guy who cannot get into the United States to fight. How on earth do you put a world championship on a guy you cannot trust to make the walk? Look at the middleweight division right now. Dricus du Plessis is the champion. Sean Strickland is sitting there screaming for a rematch. Khamzat Chimaev destroys Whittaker and jumps right to the front of the line in the minds of fans. But do you honestly think Dana White sleeps well at night thinking about Khamzat Chimaev holding the 185-pound belt? If Khamzat wins the title, what happens next? He disappears for 10 months because he gets a bad cold? He refuses to fight in Vegas because of visa issues? He misses weight for his first title defense and forces the UFC to scramble a pay-per-view main event on 48 hours' notice? The UFC is a business built on consistency. Champions anchor pay-per-views. If your champion cannot reliably anchor a card, your business bleeds money. Dana White is looking at Khamzat and seeing a massive liability wrapped in a superstar's body. They want to use him for massive Fight Island cards. They want him to sell out arenas in Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia. But putting the undisputed belt on him? That is handing over the keys to the franchise to a guy who has crashed the car 3 times already. This is why you are hearing so much weird hesitation from the UFC brass regarding Khamzat's next move. They say he is next in line, but then they immediately pivot to talking about Sean Strickland. They know Strickland will fight anyone, anywhere at any time. Strickland is an absolute workhorse. Dricus is a workhorse. Khamzat is a luxury car that stays in the garage for 11 months out of the year. And let's talk about that Whittaker fight for a second, because people are using it to validate Khamzat as the undisputed best in the world. He shot a double leg in the first 10 seconds, took Rob down, and crushed his jaw. It was a flawless performance. But it answered absolutely none of the questions we actually have about Khamzat Chimaev. What happens in the 3rd round against a guy who can actually stuff a takedown? What happens in the 4th round against a guy with cardio like Dricus du Plessis? What happens when Khamzat's arms fill with lactic acid and he has to strike moving backwards? We still don't know. Every time he has faced adversity, like the Gilbert Burns fight, he looked human. He looked exhausted. He looked beatable. Smashing Robert Whittaker in 3 minutes is incredible for the highlight reel, but it covers up the fact that Khamzat's gas tank and durability in a 5-round championship war remain completely untested. And the UFC knows this. They are protecting the mystique. They are perfectly happy letting Khamzat be the boogeyman, because the boogeyman doesn't need a belt to be scary. The second you put the belt on him, he has to defend it against the killer's row of middleweights, and the illusion of invincibility might shatter. But all of this, Islam's looming retirement, Khamzat's unreliability, the chaos in these divisions, all ties back to a much larger issue, an issue that goes way beyond matchmaking and weight cuts. Dana White is facing a crisis of control, and it has nothing to do with rival promotions. It has to do with the White House. You have all seen it. Dana White standing at the podium at political rallies. Dana White flying on private jets with politicians. The UFC has crossed over from a fringe cage-fighting spectacle into a mainstream cultural and political weapon. And while a lot of fans cheer for that, they are completely blind to the massive danger it puts the UFC in. Dana White has revealed a huge concern regarding the UFC's proximity to Washington politics, and nobody is connecting the dots. When you align a monopolistic sports entity with high-level politics, you put a massive target on your back. For 20 years, the UFC operated in the shadows. They did whatever they wanted. They controlled the fighter pay. They crushed rival promotions. They bought out Strikeforce, Pride, and WEC, and the government completely ignored them because it was just human cockfighting to the suits in Washington. They didn't care. Those days are entirely over. The UFC is now a multi-billion-dollar property owned by Endeavor, actively involved in massive cultural shifts and deeply tied to political figures. And what happens when you get too close to the sun? The government starts looking at your books. We just saw the massive antitrust lawsuit settlement. The UFC had to pay out hundreds of millions of dollars to avoid going to trial. Why did they settle? Because if they went to trial, the federal government would have completely exposed the UFC's business model. They would have cracked open the contracts. They would have exposed exactly how much power the UFC wields over independent contractors. Dana White is terrified of government intervention. He is terrified of the Ali Act being expanded to mixed martial arts. If you don't know what the Ali Act is, you need to wake up because it is the single biggest threat to UFC's existence. The Ali Act exists in boxing to protect fighters from promoters. It prevents promoters from acting as managers, and it forces transparency in revenues. If the government ever steps in and forces the Ali Act on the UFC, the entire business model collapses overnight. Dana White wouldn't be able to force fighters into bad contracts. He wouldn't be able to strip champions just because they refuse a short-notice fight. Fighters could suddenly take their belts and negotiate with outside networks. It would turn MMA into boxing. And Dana White despises boxing precisely because the promoters have no control. This is why Dana is playing this political game. He isn't just up there making speeches because he likes the spotlight. He is lobbying. He is trying to build a shield around the UFC. He knows that the regulatory eye of the government is slowly turning toward his company. There are politicians right now who want to break up the UFC's monopoly. There are legislators looking at fighter pay and health care. Dana's huge concern is that the UFC has gotten too big for its own good. When you are a small company, you can operate like a pirate ship. Dana White built the UFC operating like a ruthless pirate. But you cannot run a publicly traded, globally recognized, politically entangled corporation like a pirate ship. The Navy eventually shows up. And this political pressure is bleeding into how the UFC is run on a daily basis. Why do you think the UFC is so desperate to lock down massive broadcasting deals and push into new international markets? They are trying to secure so much capital and influence that they become untouchable. But look at the reality of the product right now. Look at the chaos Dana is trying to manage while simultaneously fighting off lawsuits and political scrutiny. You have your pound-for-pound king, Islam Makhachev, sitting on the sidelines, heavily hinting at walking away entirely. You have your biggest viral superstar, Khamzat Chimaev, struggling to string together 2 fights in a calendar year without ending up in a hospital bed. You have Conor McGregor, the biggest cash cow in the history of combat sports, completely missing in action, teasing returns that never materialize, holding up the entire hype machine. Dana White loves to project complete control. He gets at the press conference, he yells at the media, he calls people stupid, and he acts like everything is a master plan. But the curtain is slipping. The UFC is currently relying on an aging roster to prop up pay-per-views. Look at the cards we have been getting lately. They're asking guys like Dustin Poirier, Justin Gaethje, and Max Holloway to constantly save the day. Those guys are legends, but they have miles on the odometer. The UFC is desperately trying to transition to the new era, but the new era is completely unreliable. You cannot build the next decade of the UFC on the shoulders of Islam Makhachev. If Islam is going to retire in 18 months, you cannot build the next decade of the UFC on Khamzat Chimaev if Khamzat cannot fight 3 times a year. This is a transition period, and it is the most vulnerable the UFC has ever been. They are vulnerable legally, they are vulnerable politically, and they are incredibly vulnerable inside the cage. Think about the sheer amount of leverage a guy like Islam Makhachev actually holds right now. If Islam publicly said tomorrow, "I am not fighting Arman Tsarukyan, I am only fighting for the 170-pound belt, or I retire," what does the UFC do? If they strip him, they lose the entire Dagestani market. They lose the massive Abu Dhabi stronghold. They anger an entire region of the world that pours millions of dollars into UFC's pockets. If they give in, they completely destroy the integrity of the lightweight division and disrespect contenders who have bled for a shot. Islam holds all the cards. Dana hates when a fighter holds the cards. It is the exact same dynamic with Khamzat. Khamzat knows he is a massive draw. He knows the UFC needs him for the Middle East market, so he can demand massive paydays. He can take a year off. He can show up heavy, and the UFC still has to put him in marquee matchups. The leverage has shifted. For years, Dana White used the depth of the roster to crush fighter leverage. If a fighter complained, Dana would say, "Fine, sit out. We have 100 other guys ready to fight." But you don't have 100 other Islam Makhachevs. You don't have 100 other Khamzat Chimaevs. The star power is concentrated at the very top, and the guys at the top know exactly how much they are worth. This is why the government scrutiny is terrifying to UFC executives. If the fighters realize the government is watching, they might start unionizing. They might start pushing back on these restrictive contracts. The entire dam could break. People want to talk about who is fighting who next month. They want to argue about striking stats and takedown defense. That is small picture thinking. You have to look at the massive tectonic plates shifting underneath the UFC right now. Islam's potential retirement is not just a roster move. It is a massive blow to the international expansion of the company. Khamzat's health issues are not just bad luck. They are a fundamental flaw in the UFC's star-building machinery. Dana White's White House connections are not just personal friendships. They are a desperate attempt to maintain a monopoly in a world that is increasingly hostile to unregulated monopolies. The golden era of the UFC, where Dana could just throw two guys in a cage, pay them pennies, and cash massive checks while the world looked the other way, is dead and buried. We are entering an era of massive instability. We are going to see more champions walking away in their prime. You are going to see guys like Islam realize that their legacy and their health are worth more than a Reebok or Venom coupon and a pat on the back from the boss. The fighters are getting smarter. The camps are getting smarter. The managers are playing chess instead of checkers. And where does that leave the fans? It leaves us frustrated. It leaves us watching interim title fights that mean absolutely nothing. It leaves us watching Khamzat Chimaev smash a guy and then disappear into the ether for another year. You need to stop buying into the promotional spin. When Dana White gets on a microphone and says Islam is fired up to fight Arman, he is selling you a storyline. When he says Khamzat is next in line for the middleweight belt, he is stalling for time because he has no idea what to do with him. And when he stands on a political stage, he is not just supporting a candidate. He is trying to build a fortress around a business model that is under severe threat. The UFC is a house of cards right now. It looks beautiful on television. The production value is incredible. The knockouts are spectacular, but the foundation is cracking. Islam Makhachev has one foot out the door. Khamzat Chimaev cannot stay on the field, and the federal government is knocking on the front door asking to see the receipts. If you cannot see the massive storm brewing in the world of mixed martial arts right now, you are simply not paying attention. The next 12 months are going to completely redefine the sport, and it is not going to be because of what happens inside the octagon. It is going to be because of what happens in the contract negotiations, in the doctors' offices, and in the courtrooms. Wake up and watch what is actually happening.